An impoverished city-state with an ethnically and religiously diverse population incapable of coexisting with each other. A country without any resources, not even fresh water. A country on the brink of chaos, where the interests of different ethnic groups and economic crisis could totally destroy its future and wipe this small land off the map. That's how things were more than half a century ago. Now, it's a blooming garden city. In some books, it's a prime example of an economic miracle that's being reached and explored, discussed and debated upon. In fact, we will do the same. After all, Singapore's example can be used by every politician, every country to learn from, and especially in the figure of Lee Kuan Yew, who became the architect of these transformations, making it his life's work. Today, we are going to talk about Lee's political path, the difficult decisions he had to make, how pragmatism and toughness caused an unprecedented miracle, and why all the world's politicians dream of being like the leader of Singapore. And before we get into the story of the Professor of Miraculous Arts, I would highly recommend you to give our channel a subscribe. You see the videos generate lots of views, but very few subscribers. You could miss out on our new videos, which we have plenty of in the works. By the way, you should also give the channel a like, because it'll help to promote us. Also, don't forget to become a sponsor here on YouTube or on Patreon and buy me a coffee. You may find some interesting content over there too. And for now, let's take a trip to Banana Lemon Singapore. Our main man was born on September 16, 1923, into a wealthy family. Singapore was still considered one of the British colonies back then. Lee's father's side of the family came from Hakka, an ethnic group who were traditionally engaged in trade and focused on children's education, which is why they were called the Jews of the Far East. His family members were also strong Anglophiles, which is why Lee was given the English name Harry at birth. Moreover, the English language was spoken mostly within the future Prime Minister's home. He would learn Chinese and Malay later on. Harry Lee's childhood was mostly spent in diligent studies, which would later be interrupted by the outbreak of World War II. At first, the mentioned war was taking a very bad turn for the British Empire. In Europe, the Brits were being pressured by Germany, while their East colonies were already being threatened by Japanese troops who started a war in Southeast Asia under the slogan of liberating their Asian brothers from European enslavement. This wasn't good news for Lee Kuan Yew himself and the people of Singapore, since most of the island's population was Chinese, including Lee's family, who were of Chinese descent. Therefore, the chances of falling under Japanese repression were high. You see, liberating Asians from European enslavement is one thing, but you still have to fight the Chinese, because the Chinese people actively opposed the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, and even more so, they raised funds to support the Chinese army in the war against the Japanese. So, when the Japanese quickly captured the island of Singapore, the occupation authorities began to treat the locals as rather unreliable or even hostile individuals. The matter was further fueled by various pro-British groups operating on the territory of Singapore and the Malay Peninsula. While Britain, I recall, was already at war in Europe with the Germans, the Japanese ally. All of these hostility factors had triggered the so-called Sukching Massacre, intended to intimidate the local Chinese population and to wipe out some of the dangerous groups. Reprisals were supposed to be carried out against these very groups, but in fact, violence was used quite randomly against any Chinese. Needless to say, there were a huge number of victims. Estimates vary from 5 to 70,000 killed. It plays an important role in our history since Lee saw and experienced all said events by himself. His attitude towards the British Empire changed profoundly, and it was not the Japanese he felt some kind of hatred for, but the once beloved British. Why? Because, in his opinion, the Brits were shamefully defeated by the Japanese, and thus they gave up their colonies and fled like cowards. Harry Lee takes a much colder view of yesterday's rulers. In 70 years of surprises, upsets and stupidities, British colonial society was shattered, and with it, all the assumptions of the Englishman's superiority. The Asiatics were supposed to panic when the firing started, yet they were the stoical ones who took the casualties and died without hysteria. It was the white civilian bosses who ducked under tables when the bombs and shells fell. It was the white civilians and government officers in Penang who, on the 16th of December 1941, in the quiet of the night, fled the island for the safety of Singapore, abandoning the Asiatics to their fate. The whites had proved as frightened and at a loss as to what to do with the Asiatics, if not more so. The Asiatics had looked to them for leadership, and they had failed them. Lee Kuan Yew, The Singapore Story, Memoirs of Lee Kuan Yew. During the occupation, Lee did his best to avoid being caught by the military police and survive. At the end of 1943, he found himself working for the Japanese propaganda department. Great knowledge of both English and Japanese will allow him to cooperate with the Japanese occupation forces. His task was as follows: listen to Allies' radio stations and translate them into Japanese. Concurrently, in order to make it through, he was engaged in trading on the black market. Their cooperation lasted until the great samurai from across the sea gradually began to be outmatched by the Allied forces approaching the island. After the United States conducted the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan, the empire finally crumbled and lost it all. The capitulation was signed, and Singapore returned under British administration. This time, however, the small country was in a much weaker position than before. After the devastating conflict, the economic crisis, and the rapid growth of nationalism in colonies, the Brits no longer had the strength to maintain their imperialist legacy around the world. With the British Empire collapsing right before his eyes, Lee decided to pursue his studies, but now in Europe, enrolling first at the London School of Economics and then at the world-famous Cambridge University. It was there that he became convinced of his views on maintaining British rule in Asia. Lee actively supported Labour. This party championed the idea of the fastest possible decolonization, as opposed to the Conservatives, who advocated the empire's preservation. The guy even helped one of his friends in the British elections. By doing so, he gained his first real political experience. Upon his brilliant graduation in 1950, he returned back to Singapore, preparing to join Singaporean politics. His first step on the path of political struggle was the rejection of his English name Harry. Now, there was only one Lee, since his English name couldn't be warmly welcomed by the local electorate, which, as we've already discussed, has cooled down its interest in the British. Aside from working in a law firm, Lee Kuan Yew developed his political career in parallel, establishing himself as a pro-Labour politician. He represented and arranged trade unions and led strikes, even when it interfered with the business of the firm he worked for, thanks to which he was able to win massive support among ordinary Singaporeans. In his career as a lawyer, he was trained as a lawyer in England. Lee usually took cases against the British authorities, and like his defense of workers, it may have been part of his political career. Together with Sinnathamby Rajaratnam, the first future Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore, and Lim Chin Siong, one of the most influential trade union leaders in Singapore, Lee and like-minded associates actively discussed the prospect of forming their own political party. Due to the intensified anti-colonial struggle in the region, the British side had to make more and more concessions, eventually forcing Singapore to hold full-fledged elections in 1955, according to which the majority of seats in the Legislative Assembly, legislative body of Singapore, were to be elected. Prior to that, most positions were appointed by the British administration. Consequently, on November 21, 1954, the launch of the People's Action Party, or PAP, was officially announced. Next, Lee and the newly formed party were to hold their first ever elections. As you may guess, things did not go smoothly during those. For example, throughout the entire election campaign, not only was Lee accused of secretly being a communist, but also of perhaps the most terrible thing imaginable. Some assumed that Lee doesn't know Chinese, which was actually true for the most part. You see, Lee communicated in English in ordinary life and practiced Chinese and its dialects, since there are many different Chinese dialects and ethnicities represented in Singapore. He simply didn't have enough knowledge and skills on the topic. That created an opportunity for his constituency opponent to take advantage of, insisting on holding public debates in Chinese. Luckily, after much preparation and hours of rehearsal, Lee Kuan Yew was able to make his first public appearance in Chinese and win the elections. In total, his PAP party took 3 seats out of 32 possible. Later on, they were joined by another independent candidate, and their small faction of 4 was not large, but still a rising political force, the promising basis for further progress. Following the election, Lee Kuan Yew emerged as the leader of the opposition and has fully immersed himself in politics, and even got a chance to prove his worth almost immediately on April 23, 1955, with the strike of the Bus Workers Union. The whole thing was used by the PAP in order to increase pressure on the government. But as the strike went on, Lee lost control of the situation, and the strike turned into a clash. Although the workers got some of their demands accepted, it was clearly a political setback for the young group of enthusiasts. Now they were labeled a frivolous party that would go to great lengths just to undermine stability for political gain. Soon, the party was split between the moderate socialists, led by Lee Kuan Yew, and the radicals, led by Lim Chin-seong, the co-founder of PAP. Because of this crisis in their relationship, the organization almost faced disaster. The central government still helped the future Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, deal with his political rivals. In the wake of the riots in Chinese high schools, there were some at the time, the Singapore higher-ups chose to carry out an anti-communist purge, arresting all suspected leftist politicians, including Lim and other radical PAP members. Lee himself was officially a pro-communist. Many people in Singapore sympathized with communism at the time, so he voiced some communist ideas in his campaign rhetoric, but our man did nothing to free his former comrades. Why would he? I mean, with the other wing of the party effectively destroyed, he had what it took to become the next leader. Meanwhile, the Singaporean officials were actively engaged in negotiations to finally grant the island full self-governance. The negotiations had a very complicated nature, given Brits' concerns that the island's government would be unable to function properly without their supervision. Similar arguments on why not to give independence to the colonies were heard all over the world. The colonies in Africa were simply not ready, as were those in Asia, and so on. Nevertheless, in 1958, a law was passed providing for Singapore's separation as a standalone state after the elections that were to take place in 1959. Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP were ready for the upcoming elections, having the support of a significant part of the population. After the riots, they were able to restore their image by relying mainly on the Chinese electorate, and Lee also did not forget to dilute the party with people of different, both social and ethnic backgrounds. Although the Chinese stood out as the majority, there are also quite a few other ethnicities and races on the island. This and a corruption scandal involving a member of the ruling party allowed the PAP to take 43 seats out of 51 possible, a phenomenal success. On June 5, 1959, Lee Kuan Yew became Prime Minister of Singapore. Alright, we don't need to talk about the country our protagonist got in more detail. For most of its history, Lion City was not a very influential or valuable spot on the map, having no useful resources on its land, nor was it suitable for agriculture. In fact, Singapore initially served as a provincial settlement that pirates were mostly interested in. However, the increased globalization of the world and the expansion of European colonial empires have allowed Singapore to become a major trade area. You see, the place where it is situated provided the most convenient passage for ships from and to China. Thanks to this geographical position, the colonial power of Singapore was able to gain a lot of profit. Besides, thanks to all this work in favor of globalism, Singapore itself has become an embodiment of these ideas. The ethnic diversity of Singapore was very deep. For example, there were the Chinese people, who fled their native land's instability in the 19th and 20th centuries, Indians, Malays, and many others living in one place. Once the British Empire collapsed, the trading value of Singapore had decreased. China, in which the communists won, was focused on its own matters and no longer took an active part in global trade. And even if they did trade with someone, they would do so through Hong Kong instead. So, when Lee Kuan Yew became Prime Minister, here's what he inherited. A very diverse population that often hated each other, a decrease in trade after the gradual withdrawal of the British side from Singapore, decreased investments, and no investors. They were scared of the anti-colonial and socialist attitudes of the new government, afraid that their money and business would be expropriated, or simply put, snatched. On top of that, there was a lack of housing and at least a decent level of education among the local population. Not to mention an extremely high crime rate. Basically, it was a kind of Las Vegas in Southeast Asia, except that gambling, drugs, and prostitution were run by criminals, not private entrepreneurs. As you would expect, the political class in this situation was engaged in corruption, since there was zero hope of changing the existing situation. Yet Comrade Lee Kuan Yew was a completely different kind of person, who instantly initiated a rather interesting but tough policy. First of all, the guy tackled the language issue, replacing Chinese with English in the education system. However, he never forbade other languages at the official level, and on the contrary, Chinese, Tamil, English, and Malay became the official languages to satisfy different ethnic groups. His main objective lied in removing crime from Singaporean society, and Lee used all the possibilities of his monopoly on violence to achieve it. Regular police raids have become commonplace. Next step, the famous economic transformations he carried out in Singapore, but more on that later. What we must bear in mind at this moment is that after coming to power, Lee slowly shifted his political preferences. He became more loyal to the Brits and a lesser socialist, which is the exact approach he took in order to win the election. At the same time, another split is brewing in the ruling party. As you may remember, there was a faction of radical socialists in PAB. A significant part of them were prompted to positions in the Singapore government, and some of its members were imprisoned by the previous government. When Lee Kuan Yew came to power, he had been delaying their release for too long. Over time, he did release them, but that was nothing but a political mistake. Constant disputes raised between the factions. For example, Lee Kuan Yew, who used to be a trade union advocate, wanted to create one single trade union, which would be very closely linked to the central government, instead of various ones. His socialist friends frowned upon this idea, of course. Still, the straw that broke the camel's back came from the feud with the Minister of National Development, Ong Eng Guan, who continued to criticize the Brits, greatly angering his fellow party members from the Lee faction. They had already changed their position on the British people by then, which led to an open dispute. Therefore, on June 18, 1960, Ong submitted 16 resolutions against his own party, accusing them of not adhering to the ideologies of anti-colonialism and socialism. He had a point, since Lee was probably not a sincere supporter of socialism or communism for the most part at the time. He was rather a pragmatist. They also discussed the merger with Malaysia, the issue which completely turned things around in the party, causing 13 of its members to be expelled. These members and their supporters formed a brand new initiative called the Socialist Front, Barisan Socialis, which would later become one of the PAB's main enemies. As you can see, Lee was the one to emerge victorious in this confrontation. So, for example, the same large trade union that caused the splitting will continue to operate under the name of the National Trades Union Congress. But you may ask, stop. Unification with Malaysia? Didn't Lee Kuan Yew want independence and self-reliance for his own state? He did. But here is when it gets difficult, especially when you are a pragmatist. The island's economic situation was pretty bad, to say the least. A common market with Malaysia and the creation of a federal state where Singapore would have a lot of rights could cover some of its problems. Sounds promising as a solution, doesn't it? Wrong answer. The solution was met with great internal resistance in both Malaysia and Singapore. Sounds pretty strange, but the Malaysians were afraid that the Singaporean Chinese would end up gaining economic control over the entire country in case of a merger. The Socialist Front Party in Singapore was strongly against the merger, fearing to lose their power under the new federal government. Fortunately, having all the administrative means, Lee Kuan Yew successfully handled his internal enemies. He cancelled their rallies, reduced their airtime, as well as banned the printing of their propaganda. These measures were taken in anticipation of the September 1, 1962 referendum, which demonstrated the Great Rule, Those who formulate the question for a referendum win it. In other words, the no option was simply missing in that day's vote, meaning that joining Malaysia would have happened in any case, only with a different legal status. The option Lee insisted on had the flag of Singapore next to it, as if to hint at some form of independence, while the other option had a different flag, with the explanation of this stance slightly modified. The socialist opposition decided to respond by boycotting the election, urging people to submit blank unmarked ballots. Lee countered their plan, stating that all blank votes would be added to the option receiving the most votes. Feels very democratic indeed. In the end, 26% of the ballots were blank, and sure enough, another victory went to Lee. Further on, the Prime Minister will begin repressions against former associates. After all, one of the conditions for Singapore's entry into Malaysia was the arrest of any politically unreliable individuals. Simply put, the radical socialists. Our man himself was not very happy about their opposition politics. Anyway, he needed a reason to do so, and he found one. Due to the fact of the Socialist Front leaders' imprudence in supporting the uprising in Brunei, they could easily be painted as political radicals. Therefore, after lengthy negotiations between Lee and representatives of Malaysia, the cold store operation was approved, leading to 113 detentions and allowing Lee's team to totally paralyze the opposition. Even though Lee Kuan Yew often said in his memoirs that he didn't really support the operation, a later declassified British document said quite the opposite, after which Comrade Lee admitted to actively supporting the campaign against political rivals. On September 16, 1963, Singapore finally joined the Malaysian Federation, and the PAP secured a complete victory over the Socialist Front in the same year's elections. But stories never end in a happy victory. It's not a movie. New challenges, hurdles, and unexpected events are always around the corner. See? One cannot just relax on their laurels. Relations between the PAP and the Malaysian ruling party have started to deteriorate almost immediately. One of the main reasons for that was Lee's desire to put his influence on the affairs of the whole of Malaysia, not just a small part of it, Singapore. Despite the agreements before Singapore was admitted to the Malay Federation, he did not fulfill his promise. In addition, relations between the Chinese and the Malays left much to be desired, and, as you remember, the vast majority of people in Singapore were Chinese. Therefore, no peace ensued after they merged with Malaysia. The situation in the city-state itself was no less heated, especially since it was home to a significant number of Malaysians. Any wrong move by the government could lead to riots. Moreover, the Malaysian authorities were willing to exploit these tensions in order to harm the newly emerging competitors in the person of Lee and his men. For example, in March 1964, huge protests broke out after old houses, mostly inhabited by Malays, were demolished as part of a housing renovation program in order to build new ones in their place, where these same residents would be settled. Lee's Malaysian opponents took advantage of the situation and accused him of racial segregation. Other riots took place in July of the same year, during the celebration of Muhammad's birthday. Yes, I'm talking about the Prophet Muhammad. Aside from ethnic, there are also religious differences, with the Malays being mostly Muslim and the Chinese being Confucians or Buddhists. None of that helped to create harmony either. Consequently, after a short period of growing tension, the Malaysian federal government, again, fearful of Singapore's economic expansion, decided to negotiate with Singapore over its accession from the Federation through Britain. Lee Kuan Yew took it very painfully, barely holding back his tears in a televised address to the nation. 1966 was almost the most difficult year in Lee's life. Almost everyone considered the newly formed state doomed, with its unstable society and the worthless economy. But, as he once did at the beginning of his political journey, Lee Kuan Yew didn't give up and continued fighting. The first concern on the agenda was all about safety. A number of radical Malaysian politicians were advocating for Singapore annexation once again, but this time without the right of self-governance and using force. Something had to be done in order to guarantee safety against such encroachments. not to mention the neighboring big power, Indonesia, having its own plans on Singapore. That's why the young country needed to find a patron and an ally. You might have thought that they already had one in the form of the United Kingdom, who already had a military base stationed there. Unfortunately, those times were extremely difficult for yesterday's empire, and basically, a trend had emerged in Britain's policy to reduce its presence in east of Suez, meaning the withdrawal of troops from Asia as a priority. The option with the UK was no longer an option to count on. Maybe America could have become such a patron. No way. The US was stuck in the Vietnamese guerrilla war at the time. On the other hand, anti-American sentiment was increasing among other countries in the region. So, as the Prime Minister himself believed, replacing the British patron with an American patron would be too politically expensive, as it would spoil relations with the neighboring countries. It was thus decided that all the new states' diplomatic efforts should be spent on extending the British military presence. In addition to the state security, the lives of the Prime Minister and his family were also at risk, with Malay nationalists making assassination attempts. They had to move to another house near a British airbase. Lee himself was constantly sleep-deprived due to loads of work and stress. He had to keep going through difficult conditions. At some point, his house didn't have bulletproof glass, so metal plates were put instead of windows. The rooms looked more like a prison basement than the home of the main politician of a small country. Another important priority included the creation of an own small army and, of course, a police force. To pull this off, Lee combined the Ministry of Defense with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, appointing his trusted associate Goh Keng Swee as the head of the ministry. Under his guidance, the recruiting process was fruitful, though it went not without setbacks, one of which occurred in 1966. Due to Singapore's separation from Malaysia, a very large segment of recruits and military personnel of Malaysian origin were left without a job, as the Minister of Defense gave a specific order to stop their military training. After an undeniably wise display of tolerance, all these recruits launched a protest, which turned into a clash. All of them were successfully detained afterwards. There is more to the story. However, as the said citizens of Malaysia cannot simply be left in custody or released. In both cases, this would have led to racial riots. With that in mind, the Prime Minister stepped into action himself. He arrived at the site and, despite the risks, decided to talk to the protesters. His speech was in Malay. Lee explained the release issue as a case of the commander misinterpreting an order, and that those who had Singaporean citizenship should return to the camp and resume normal training. Only citizens of Singapore had the right to return, with those without it having to look for work in Malaysia. It wasn't a matter of origin, but of citizenship. His speech was met with applause. The situation was resolved on a peaceful note. As things came to building a new police force, Lee had to use more cunning tactics. Gurkhas were hired for key positions in the police. These were British Empire mercenaries, recruited from Nepal. Why them? To avoid provocations, cases like a Chinese officer shooting a Malay or vice versa, which can indeed cause racial riots. Therefore, it was possible to build an effective police force without pressuring either of the two warring population groups. Turns out, Singapore's problems were not really unique. Lee quickly realized how useful Israel and its experience in nation-building could be. Singapore and Israel are both small, young countries surrounded by hostile Muslim countries. They are both divided into two large ethnic groups. In Israel, these are Arabs, Palestinians and Jews, and in Singapore, these are Chinese and Malaysians. For this reason, contact and cooperation were established between Israel and Singapore almost instantaneously. IDF officers came to Singapore so that they could help develop the army. Contacts were also established with Taiwan, another remote country, somewhat similar to Singapore. Concurrently, Lee tried to pursue a policy of neutrality by not openly joining the communist bloc or, on the contrary, the democratic one, all just to reduce the number of reasons to use force against his side. The Army of Singapore, which had a small mobilization resource and couldn't withstand a large conventional war against, for example, Malaysia or Indonesia, was supposed to take care of it. But there was no need to use their help. Well, the main defense strategy was to make the invasion as unpleasant as possible for a potential enemy. As early as the 1970s, Singapore's army had approximately 300,000 regular and reserve soldiers. At the same time, they constantly improved their own equipment and weapons. For example, in the 80s, tiny Singapore had 8 F-16 fighters. To have vehicles of F-16 profile is no cheap pleasure. Where did little Singapore get money for that? Congratulations, we finally made it to the Singapore economic miracle. As I said earlier, at the beginning of its existence, Singapore found itself in a very harsh state. Their path to prosperity is not the most typical story to hear. For most of us, economic growth is associated with total freedom, right? Sure, freedom is a must, which means less economic regulations, more political freedom, free courts and institutions. But again, at the beginning of its journey, Singapore was a very weak state that couldn't just let things flow. Those spheres of life the government was responsible for needed to be stabilized, like security, both external, which we've already discussed, and internal, from upheavals and crime. Besides, the state must prove itself effective in protecting people's rights to conduct legal business. Lee's methods were radical, but there was a clear idea behind them. First things first, someone must have taken care of social problems, crime, etc. The new state positioned itself as a multicultural nation. Now, the rebel and destabilizer will serve a term for his political preferences, regardless of ethnicity or race. The same goes to crime. Singapore's social stability was built on rigid, almost dictatorial restrictions. Every individual who had radical political preferences, from Malaysian nationalists, those who wanted to go back to the Great Malaysia, back to Chinese socialists, those who wanted to unite with their communist brother, all of them will be put behind communist bars, and it doesn't matter much what allegations were made before. Not the case here. They will simply be imprisoned for an unlimited period of time, until the reasons are found out. As we can see, the usual courts won't work here. Again, measures like the said one were mostly specifically to eliminate dubious individuals, not to shut down someone's business and put someone on a bad record thanks to the state racket. Physical punishment for lawbreakers was also a very common practice in Singapore, and it still is used today. People's drug addiction was solved quite simply, by applying absolutely draconian measures to violators. Odd as it may sound, the approach totally justified itself. The country was stabilized, and the problem of crime and drug addiction was almost solved. Although one could very easily accuse Lee Kuan Yew of using dictatorial and authoritarian methods of state governance, but in the situation of being surrounded by hostile countries outside and political instability inside, the measures can be excused, especially if there are achievements in the economic field. I believe few of us are dictatorship supporters. Nevertheless, we have to admit, Lee Kuan Yew showed an exceptional example from an endless list of mad dictators. Even the population itself accepted such methods, since they saw how Lee and his party indeed had a plan for improving the country's economic state. Okay, let's be fair now. They liked it because there were more and more social programs to follow. One of the first decisions made by the new government involved the construction of new houses for the citizens. And despite Singapore generally being associated with the free market, its first social change was the purchase of land at low prices and the creation of a public housing system. Consequently, ordinary people were largely satisfied with the new order. But socialism is not enough to unleash an economic miracle. The most important factor for an economic miracle, besides creating a strong state, is that this state should be effective and not corrupt, with the latter popping up as one of the main obstacles for the Singapore miracle. The situation was quite special, given that the vast majority of the population were Chinese, who preserved Chinese traditions, one of which requires to come to an important official with a gift. In some sense, here we have the definition of corruption. As a way of combating this problem, Lee gave an enormous amount of power to the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau. Its main goal was to carry out the anti-corruption operations without where, who, or what exceptions. The corrupt person will face justice regardless of connections and social status. Even in 1960, a law was passed on the so-called presumption of guilt, according to which evidence of corruption could be presented by the mere fact that a person lived beyond their means of their salary. Also, any person could receive a reward for any info regarding a corrupted official. Still, the unique feature of Lee's authoritarian and harsh methods is that equality before the law did exist. Corruption cases were opened not only against politicians and officials who interfered with the government, but even against Lee and his family members. 3 such cases were opened, yet no evidence was found and charges were dropped. It's simply impossible to imagine some other country's prosecutor general opening a case against the current president or something like that. Occasions of ordinary people finding fishy stuff on big authority figures are also rare. But again, here you have it as a common practice in Singapore. Case in point, the Minister of National Development of Singapore was accused of receiving several bribes totaling $1 million. He had to use this money to preserve and repurchase a piece of land from 2 companies. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau found out about these cases, but the sad minister couldn't cope with the pressures and committed suicide. In other words, Singapore had an effective anti-corruption strategy, but this was not enough for economic growth too. Singapore's further development required an educated workforce. Because of that, an extremely well-rounded education system was created, where personal initiative and following the order were valued the most. Also, for the sake of reducing corruption and increasing the government's productivity, Singapore has been making constant bureaucratic cuts, and overall, both in the present and in the past, they always did whatever it took to minimize bureaucracy and the state apparatus. It doesn't have to be big, it has to be organized efficiently. Those who remained in the government bureaucracy were given higher salaries so as to compete with the private spheres and attract ambitious and high-performing employees. Thus, one finds less sense in stealing and taking bribes, right? On the other hand, some countries find it customary to lower the salary of civil servants so that no one with a sane mind would even think of moving there. For example, I'll never go to work in the public sector for such a low salary. Why would I need that? Especially if I can earn many more times more in other areas without constant control by society and various bodies and with less stress. Lee was aware of the problem and went on to correct this irregularity. Again, the inevitable punishment for corruption and high salaries have made the Singaporean bureaucracy highly efficient. Singapore also suffered from a severe unemployment crisis. The Singaporean authorities went looking for investors around the world who would be eager to build factories and other industries on the island because labor was cheap and unemployed. For this purpose, Lee's men used personal connections with top managers of various companies just to reassure them of all the benefits of investing in the country and to convince them that their business would not suffer from Lee's authoritarianism. We also need to think of Singapore's great advantages in terms of its location, which also helped to attract investors to the production facilities. Without the British infrastructure that had already been built on the island, it would have taken much longer for investors to arrive. Thus, after gaining independence, Singapore inherited a large naval base and port, which was later rebuilt into a civilian port for easier and more functional product shipping in and out of Singapore. Thanks to these changes, the Lee Kuan Yew government was able to catch the attention of multinational corporations to the island. Educated and hard-working residents, low corruption, high stability, solid infrastructure, low crime rate, and most importantly, extremely low taxes, notably for large corporations, or even exemption from any taxes for a significant period of time. All of that laid the foundation for Singapore's economic success, not only as a financial center, but also as an industrial one. It was not about primitive goods made of plastic or clothing, but high-tech goods only. At the end of the 70s, Singapore stood out as one of the largest exporters of electronics, steel, and oil products. Feeling economical growth, Singapore has improved its relations with neighbors, to the point that in the mid-70s, Indonesia and Malaysia were no longer enemies to them. Fairly close ties have also been established with China. For instance, Deng Xiaoping's reforms were inspired by Singapore's experience. Singapore was even able to improve good relations with the USA. Well, you probably got the impression that they want it all. They have no weakness. Why should there be any? They came up with a perfect political system, a neutral authoritarian country without corruption. Is that it? No. Turns out, the famous draconian measures also had the other side, the much darker side. There were many restrictions, like the ban on kissing in the street and the use of chewing gum, a culture of work that forces people to fully devote themselves to their jobs, and many other factors, has made this rich nation one of the most depressed. Because of it, prosperous Singapore had problems with emigration, since many educated Singaporeans who received a good education in their motherland simply decided not to stay on the island any longer and traveled to much more attractive places. Imagine how easy it was for a native Singaporean with a good education and knowledge of Chinese, English, and some other languages to move to another country. However, these problems appear to be somewhat simpler to resolve than the total corruption, crime, and poverty, especially when you have a lot of money. In order to combat the out-migration, the Singaporean officials took steps to improve the environment, clean up the rivers, and expand the island's area by making artificial embankments, as well as to ensure self-sufficiency in clean water, which they did in 2010. A country once dependent on Malaysia in the 60s, because the latter could cut off their water supply at any time, Singapore is now self-sufficient and does not have to worry about any of this. Today it looks like a garden city with no out-migration concerns. Quite the contrary, professionals from all over the world are coming there to work, for example, in the offices of global transnational corporations. And what about Singapore's political life? Did it also remain balanced? Well, until the 90s, yes. Until Lee resigned as Prime Minister and took the chair of the so-called Senior Minister. This way, he seemed to step back from governing the country and served only as a consultant. A typical strategy for authoritarian leaders. Someone tried to pull off a similar trick in Kazakhstan, for example, when Nazarbayev stepped down as president and took a sort of ceremonial position of a wise old man who wasn't responsible for a single thing. He only gave advice. Lee became a legend of world politics during his lifetime, while Singapore gained its iconic status of a country that has gone from rags to riches and made its citizens wealthy in the process. Therefore, as soon as Lee left the post of Prime Minister, he traveled a lot around the world and met with various leaders of other countries. At some point, he even visited Ukraine and met with Yanukovych. Many wanted to simply stand near him to get some of his positive image, present themselves as reformers, oriented specifically towards Lee Kuan Yew. For example, Saakashvili always described his reforms as inspired by the Singapore experience. In recent years, Lee struggled with illness and finally stepped down from power. A wise decision to make at that moment, otherwise Singapore would have turned into a monarchy or would have had serious internal political burdens to solve, as well as instability. Different political groups began to fight for the legacy of a dictator who held onto power until the end of his life, but he was the one who left in time. Lee didn't want to create dictatorships like the USSR or communist Romania. He wanted to go for meritocracy, which is the power of the best, where the system itself was supposed to bring the smartest and best people of their fields to the top. Whether he succeeded or not, we'll know for sure in a couple of decades. Looks like Singapore has succeeded. So far. Lee died on March 3, 2015, at the age of 91. If we are to talk about the life of Lee Kuan Yew, we can note him certainly being an open-minded, creative, but at the same time a very pragmatic leader. He had one objective in his mind, to make his own country prosperous, and we must admit, he achieved what he wanted. The example of Lee's Singapore makes many wonder whether dictatorship is really a bad thing, or can it be applicable at times? Is the very goal of political freedom a good idea? Would economic growth, security, and prosperity be of better fit? The story of Lee Kuan Yew breaks stereotypes and ideas about the world as a whole. He is a unique person with a unique destiny. With that said, we shouldn't forget that transformations require proper preconditions. British economic and political institutions, the country's state, favorable external conditions. If Lee was surrounded by some Yanukovych type of individuals, the outcome of his career would most likely be different. Nevertheless, our today's main man can be presented as an example of a genuinely good politician who didn't waste his opportunities, but took full advantage of them, all for the sake of his own country.